Hello and welcome to another photographic morning with the Canon R5 at the Maroochy Wetland Sanctuary. My name's Barry Beckham. The Maroochy Wetland Sanctuary is a 2-kilometre boardwalk through the mangrove forest to the Maroochy River, and it boasts 200 species of birds, which was my subject that morning. Now there was only one problem. Well, maybe three actually. The first was that it was raining at 6:30 when I got there. The second was the 2 million mosquitoes who came to greet me. And third, there were no birds. Well, that's not strictly true. Of course there were birds, but none willing to sit still long enough and pose for a shot. But that's wildlife photography. You win some and you lose some. The good news is it stopped raining soon after I got there, and I did come to an agreement with the mosquitoes. I would leave them alone if they would leave me alone. It partially worked. So in the absence of the birds, I decided to take a few general shots using the Canon RF 35mm 1.8 lens. If you're going into a forest, doing that just after it's rained isn't a bad idea, because we're not battling high contrast from a sunny day. The light is much softer and more forgiving. It's just better all round for this type of subject. The trees and leaves are all wet, which makes the greens rich in colour and almost soothing to the eye. I decided to put a polarising filter on the lens to minimise reflections from the water on the leaves, and I also decided to rely on the Canon R5's in-body image stabilisation. I never took a tripod this morning. Now I think there's just something different about morning in the forest, especially in the rain, or in my case, soon after the rain. And for my UK friends, I stopped to take this picture. Look out for kangaroos, possums, echidnas, water birds and snakes. I notice the mosquitoes are not included on the sign. Now when we're shooting images in a forest, we're faced with an enormous amount of detail. So one of the things we have to do is firstly find a nice composition to help the picture along, and if we can, some sort of lead in, and sometimes a pathway, in this case maybe a road, is what plays that role. But composition is important, otherwise we're just looking at a sea of green. One of the things that's often said in relation to photography is if you're not out there, then you're certainly not going to get the shots. This was not actually in the wetlands at all. This was just alongside the car park, and it's a case of being in the right place at the right time. It's raining lightly here. We've got heavy clouds, but that brief moment when the sun bursts through and lights up the foliage on the left-hand side. But as well as that, we've got pretty good composition too. And the way the plastic, trying to encourage the growth of whatever the farmers planted, is giving us that depth and a way to get to the point which is the most interesting. Now once again, it's the wet day, but also the composition that's playing a large part in this image. We can see the broad wet leaves on the left are perfectly placed across that rule of thirds vertical and horizontal line. The tree on the right, not quite on the perfect spot, but getting close to it, and we even have an implied level on the right hand side, and I think that is the pathway leading into the wetlands. And if you look at the panel I've put up at the top right, you can see I am using that image stabilisation to some degree with 1/10 of a second at f4. f4 not a great problem with a 35mm lens, but as you can see, so dull that I needed 800 ISO to achieve that. This image gives a much better idea of what the raised walkway is like. But if we look at this image from a composition point of view, it doesn't fit the classic lines of the rule of thirds, and yet I hope you'll agree with me when I say the image does seem to have some appeal. It works. Now at first glance when we see this image, it doesn't seem to have a great deal of composition going for it, but an attempt was made to create some. But here I've used the aperture to give me a little help. Looking at the data at the top right, you can see 400 ISO, 2/100ths of a second, no problem there, but the lens was wide open at 1.8. Being critical of my own work, perhaps I could have got a little bit closer to that foreground batch of leaves, and then the background ones would be even softer than they are now. This image may be described as having a more classical composition, with those uprights on the left and right being perfectly placed for the tree on the left and the right. But I've also used a very shallow depth of field to try to help with the depth. What a great old tree this is, growing among the mangroves. I wonder how long that's been there. Once again, the composition is pretty good here, with important parts of the picture falling nicely on the strong parts of the rule of thirds. And as you can see by the data at the top right, 1/25th of a second at f6.3, 400 ISO. So I'm sort of relying a little bit more here on the image stabilization of the Canon R5 along with that of the lens. Now here's a shot which I suppose we could say almost composed itself. Where else can we put that shelter but in the middle of the frame here, especially as we're standing on the raised walkway. But although the structure is pretty central in the frame here, we can also see that it works extremely well with composition too, with both the uprights, the upper horizontal, the lower horizontal, and the places they all cross. And you can see from the top right, F11 to make sure everything is sharp from foreground to background. Now these images may not be standalone prize-winning shots, but what I try to do with all of my image editing is to make the very best from the image that I've captured, which in this case would be a raw file, of course, making sure that I get good shadow detail, good highlight detail, great colour, and everything sharp where it needs to be sharp. And if I've got to spend 10 minutes on a shot like this in Photoshop, then I'll do so. Now we don't have to fight to achieve classic composition every single time, so that the elements always fall on those uprights and horizontals. But when we're in the forest, it certainly helps if we can get close. So I got up early, and despite the weather I went to Maroochy Wetland Sanctuary to shoot birds. But of course if I can't do that, there was no way I was going home empty-handed. Now one thing I did get lucky with was the fact that it rained quite heavily during the night and in the morning, but it stopped just as I got to the wetlands, so I was able to shoot the mangrove forest at its very best. When we're in the forest, especially in overcast conditions, exposure can be quite important too. Automatic settings can sometimes overexpose our shots, because the camera sees a darker scene than normal and it wants to give more exposure, but in doing so it can blow out the highlights and reduce the appeal considerably. So in overcast conditions you may find it necessary to reduce exposure by around 1 stop if you're shooting aperture priority as an example. Just keep your eye on that LCD. I'll see you next time.